In Mark chapter 1, as Christ began, or shortly after Christ began His earthly ministry, you remember that He was walking alongside the Sea of Galilee, and He began to choose His apostles, those men in whom He saw certain characteristics that He knew would be necessary for them to accomplish successfully the work that He needed them to do. And particularly in Mark chapter 1, you remember that He walked by and He saw Peter and Andrew sitting over to the side, tending their nets. And He called to them and told them to come and to follow after Him, two fishermen by trade. And if they would follow after Him, what would He do? He said, "And I will make you to become fishers of men." It's interesting that on this first occasion, as Christ calls these first two men, fishermen by trade, that He uses their regular occupation to illustrate to them the task that He says would make them true disciples of His. To go out into the world, to cast the bait, figuratively speaking, and to draw as many men unto the fold as they possibly could. You know, fishing for centuries has not just been a hobby. I think for practically anyone here who has any interest in fishing, that's all it is. It's a hobby. Something that you enjoy doing. But for centuries, it's been much more than a hobby to many people, particularly in other areas of the world, and even more particularly in this area of the world, in this particular time in the first century. It was a way of life. It was a way that people lived. A way that they were able to go about every day providing for themselves and for their family to make sure that everything that they needed would be provided. But I think you would agree with me in this, that whether fishing is done recreationally or whether it is done professionally, there are certain traits that are required in order to be successful in that endeavor. And now that's contrary to what many people believe about fishing, and particularly when I do it, that it's nothing more than the luck of the draw. You just pick a spot that looks good, pick something out of your tackle box that looks good, throw it into the water, and just see what happens without any expectation. For some of us, that's how it's done. If you catch one, that's fine. If not, well, you have something to gripe about later on in the day. With other people, it's a much more scientific, perhaps for lack of a better term, ordeal. They know exactly where to go. They know exactly how deep to fish for what type of fish they want. They know exactly what type of bait or lure to use. They have all the latest equipment that will ensure them the catch that they so desire. And there's a big difference between the two approaches to that particular endeavor. But one way or the other, there are at least three particular traits, requirements, that I want to talk about tonight that are necessary to make you a good, successful fisherman. Not a fish, but an application of that, becoming fishers of men. Things that are necessary for us to incorporate into our lives to be able to do exactly what Christ has commissioned these men to do in Mark chapter 1. And in Mark chapter 1, I believe one thing we see inherent in the statement that Jesus makes here is that in order to become a good, successful fisher of men, it takes patience. You want to be a soul winner? You want to lead people to Christ and do everything that you can to build up the church locally as well as universally? It's going to take a lot of patience. You see, because being a soul winner, like fishing, in some ways is not an exact science. There are a lot of unknown variables in the mix that you have to consider as you approach that responsibility. Now, I want to say this though. Don't get me wrong. The unknown variables have nothing to do with what God has told us to do or how He's told us to do it. Those things are clear-cut and standard and universal to us all. The unknown variables of which I speak, rather, are on behalf of those with whom we are trying to connect. There are some things in some people's lives that we just don't know about that sometimes could be helpful to know in the process of confronting them with the gospel. And really can make all the difference as to whether we find ourselves successful or not. Now, like a fisherman, we may know every tool available to use in making a catch. However, also like a fisherman, we don't know exactly from person to person what might be the best attraction to a likely candidate with the gospel. You know, maybe somebody's struggling with something in their lives that could really be of help to them, that would really open their hearts to the entirety of the gospel message. Maybe we know about it, but maybe we don't. Things like that can help us as we approach people with the gospel. Maybe they're hurting. Maybe they've just had a loved one who's died. And they're in need of someone who can provide them the comfort of God. Well, friends, if I know that ahead of time, guess what might be the best way to approach them with the gospel? To talk to them about the comfort that we can have and how we can achieve it. Maybe somebody else has something else going on in life that we may know about. Guess what might be the best way to approach them with the gospel? Whatever it is they're facing. Sometimes we can know that, but sometimes we don't. And so we have to realize that from person to person, from opportunity to opportunity, those variables are going to be one thing at one time and something different in another. And failure to accomplish your purpose is going to be the most likely reason to quit trying. And so what's demanded of us? Patience. Know that things aren't going to happen immediately. And you know, we kind of have this general attitude in life, and I'm throwing myself in here. I'm not casting this on anyone else. I'm saying this about myself. Sometimes when we want something, we want it yesterday. And you know, sometimes that's true when it comes to studying the Bible with people. We want to make an impact. We want people to obey the gospel, but guess what? We wanted them to do it yesterday. We're impatient. It's not going to happen that way. It's going to require time and long suffering and effort in order for these things to develop. The Bible refers abundantly to patience as a virtue of Christianity. You can look at various passages like 2 Corinthians 6, 3 and 4, 2 Corinthians 12 and verse 12, Colossians 1 and verse 11. And you see patience being listed among virtues in a number of different passages. 1 Timothy 6, 2 Timothy 3, Titus 2, Hebrews 10, James chapter 1. I want to turn though to James chapter 5, because in James 5, I believe we find perhaps the most enduring commendation of patience in James chapter 5, verses 10 and 11. Remember there, James wrote, "Take my brethren, the prophets, who have spoken in the name of the Lord for an example of suffering, affliction, and of what? Patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. Ye have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy." Think about those people that James is addressing there. He talks about the prophets, he talks about Job, and he talks about everything that they had to endure, and oh, what they had to endure. We're familiar with Job and everything he had to go through. Losing his family, losing his livelihood, losing his health. In a matter of one day losing most of it, and in another day losing the rest of it. And yet he was able to patiently endure Think about the prophets, though. In Hebrews 11, the Hebrews writer talks some about exactly what those prophets had to endure as they attempted to work for God. He says, beginning in verse 32, at the very end of that passage, he begins talking about the prophets who, verse 33, through faith subdued kingdoms, wrought righteousness, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the violence of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, waxed valiant in fight, turned to flight the armies of the aliens. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance that they might obtain a better resurrection. Others had trial of cruel mockings and scourgings, yea, moreover of bonds and imprisonment. And they were stoned, they were sawn asunder, tempted, were slain with the sword. They wandered around in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented. And can you imagine being called to the greatest work available? To work on behalf of God among His own people, to try to bring meaningful change, and yet to be treated like this. You would think they would have received a hero's welcome. Here come the prophets. They're here to take care of everything that's wrong, to see us in the pitiful state we are spiritually and try to deliver us out of it. But it was anything but that. They received the cruelest of welcomes. And yet what happened? They patiently endured. Why? Because they had an earnest desire for the souls of men. And whatever they had to endure in the process was a small matter in comparison. Friends, we as New Testament Christians are involved in the greatest work that we could possibly have, in which we could possibly be engaged. And that is in the work of serving God and reaching lost souls, every one of us. Now, we're going to receive cruel welcomes. And we're going to find ourselves at times seemingly ineffective, or at least that's what we believe. We're going to be rejected. We're going to have people that we just want to pull our hair out over because we think they ought to get it and they just don't. When Jesus told Peter and Andrew in Mark 1 that if they would follow after Him, He would make them fishers of men, I believe implied in that statement is in order for that to be accomplished, it would require patience. Peter wasn't necessarily always the most patient man. And I believe we learn a lesson from his impatience at times. But I think that is such a vital aspect of our work if we too are to become fishers of men. And secondly, not only is patience implied in such a passage, but likewise I believe that implied would be the need for persistence. Because upon developing patience, the next logical step is persistence. And I've heard it stated this way, stick-to-itiveness. In other words, you've got to stick to it. Keep going. Don't let it get you down. Don't let it discourage you. Don't get to the point where you say, well, I'm not accomplishing anything. I'm just wasting my time. Friends, if we are taking the gospel to the lost, we are doing anything but wasting our time. Now, we may not be from the outward appearance getting the results that we might want or that we might think we should be getting, but we are never wasting our time when we are helping people study the gospel, because you never know where it can go from there. Like Samuel, we must remember that when a person rejects the gospel, they're not rejecting you and they're not rejecting me. They're rejecting God. And that's sad, it's terrible. But it should not discourage us from continuing in our efforts. 1 Samuel chapter 8, you remember, particularly for our young people who've been studying this is around the area you're in. In 1 Samuel 8, Samuel was getting old. He had appointed his sons, Joel and Abihu, to be the leaders after he was gone. But they had proven to be no better, morally speaking, than Hophni and Phinehas. And the people saw that. They weren't ignorant. They saw the inconsistency in these two men and Samuel's attempt for them to be spiritual leaders when they were themselves spiritually depraved. And so they came to Samuel, and in their minds this was a logical decision. Now it wasn't, but they thought it was. They said, Samuel, we want a king like the nations. You're getting old, you're going to die. And your sons are not capable of effectively leading us as you have. We need something else. We need a king. A king that will make us like all the nations. Well, that didn't sit too well with Samuel, did it? He kind of took it personally. He took it as an indictment on himself and certainly as an indictment on God. And when he approached God about the matter, he was upset. But God said, Samuel, don't be upset. Because they're not rejecting you, they're rejecting me. It's terrible. Should never happen. But God said it in order to encourage Samuel to not give up. To not say, well, I've worked among these people my entire life. From the day that he was weaned and his mother took him to serve under Eli until the day that he died, Samuel worked steadfastly among these people to try to establish some degree of righteousness among them. And now it's apparent to him that in his mind he's failed. They've rejected him. But they really hadn't. They'd rejected God. And so he didn't need to give up. He didn't need to get discouraged. He needed to press on and do everything else he possibly could in the remaining time that he had. What a great lesson that is to us in our need to be persistent as fishers of men. All of the successful servants of God in the Bible had to persist. Why do we think we're going to be any different? Moses had to persist, though time and time again the Israelites rejected him and God both. Moses had to be bald. He had to be. Because no ordinary man would have to endure everything the Israelites put him through without him pulling his hair out. He had to be bald for that reason. But he didn't give up. He had to persist. The prophets had to persist, though the nation would reject them, persecute them, and even kill them. They couldn't afford to give up. They were their last chance. Jesus at first was rejected by many, but what happened? He persisted. And though many still continued to reject Him, He found Himself winning more and more as time went by. Each of the apostles faced the temptation to quit. In fact, at times all of them did. And yet, eventually, they all would come back and persist, finding success in their service to God. Paul, as much as anybody, had to face adversity, but he never quit. He actually joyed in the opportunity he had to suffer for the cause of his God. And when it comes to fishing, whether it's for actual fish or whether we're fishing for souls, we have to persist. We have to keep going. We have to keep trying. We cannot afford to give up. As the old saying goes, if at first you don't succeed, you try. And you try and you try again. And every time that you try, you have succeeded in doing exactly what God has told you to do, because He never told you you had to convert a soul, did He? No, He said you need to teach and leave the conversion up to Him. 1 Corinthians chapter 3, Paul said, I sowed, Apollos watered. What happened? Did Barnabas come along and give the increase? No. God gave the increase. God has never placed the expectation upon any of His servants to ever be responsible for converting a soul. That is simply too much of responsibility. We do not have the capability to convert a soul. But what we do have the capability of doing is teaching them the gospel which is able to convert them. And if you have taught the gospel, and if you are continuing to teach the gospel, you have done your job, irregardless of how it has been accepted. You have to persist. And if you do that, at the end it will be enough. One final characteristic that I would like to draw quickly from Mark chapter 1 is that in the process of becoming a fisher of men, not only is it going to require patience, not only is it going to require persistence, finally it's going to require practice. You see, a common thread that's found in the greatest of fishermen is that they have committed themselves to earnest preparation. Every day, at least every day they have the opportunity, they're up at the crack of dawn. And they're out on the water. They're doing it. They're not stuck in a book reading about how should I fish? What are some practical tips for fishing? Where's the best place to go? What's the best thing to use? Sure, they might have done that at some point, and they might find themselves touching up on it here and there, but what they do is they get out there and they do it. If we're going to be effective soul winners for God, it is going to require absolute dedication in intense preparation for this task to which we have been committed. Now, that preparation includes a number of things. It includes study. I need to spend time in the book every day on a regular basis. Because how in the world am I going to tell somebody what they need to do if I don't know what to do? I need to study. I need to pray about it. We're talking about spiritual matters, things that ultimately are left between an individual and God. And how in the world could we dare approach such an immense responsibility without first taking it to God in prayer? I need to pray. Well, guess what I need to do then? I need to study some more. I need to spend some more time in the book. After that, I need to establish humility in my life and realize that at the end of the day, it has nothing to do with me. I am but a humble servant and messenger, so to speak, in taking the gospel to the lost. I'm just telling people what God told me to tell them, nothing more, nothing less. And I take myself and my own personality out of the equation. I humble myself. Well, what do I do then? I study some more. I spend some more time in the book. I obey God's plan. I go about doing it. I talk to people. I converse with people. I do everything I can to impact people. And then I study some more. See a common thread running through there. You cannot be an effective soul winner, a fisher of men, if you have subtracted this book from your life. It is impossible. Can't do it. Have to spend time in the book. I have to study. I have to know what it is that I am expected to take to those people with whom I am having regular conversation. Now, what should likewise be stressed, though, is it's going to be an immense amount of work. And sometimes I wonder if that's not what keeps so many people from doing it, but at other times I kind of question whether that is the deciding factor. It's an immense amount of work, but guess what? Comparatively speaking, it's nothing in this sense. Compared to the marvelous blessings that are awaiting us for doing it, and those with whom we have success for their obedience. The cost is virtually nothing in comparison to what ultimately is gained. In various passages throughout the New Testament, you see the inspired writers emphasizing the necessity of evangelistic work. Acts 20, 2 Timothy 2, 2 Timothy 4. We must be committed to this practice in our lives and just go about doing it. Jump in head first and do everything that we can in the best way that we can to the greatest success that we can possibly achieve. And as we commit ourselves to that task, so shall those marvelous blessings be committed to us both now and ultimately in heaven for all eternity. And I don't know if there's a more noble cause. In fact, I know there's not a more noble cause to which we could be committed than to be fishers of men. To have humbled ourselves under the authority of our God, who has commissioned us to go into the world and take the gospel with us to every soul with whom we can possibly have contact. And sometimes we may think, well, how in the world can I do that, and how can I be effective in it? I want to do it, but if I'm going to do it, I want to do it and be able to impact people. What can I do? Well, there's so many other things that could be mentioned, but I think if we at least take these three with us, we might be just a little bit more equipped to be able to, on a regular, daily basis, go out and try to reach the lost. Because, friends, that's what it's all about. It's about souls. And when we think souls, and it becomes the centerpiece of our lives and our work, then that job just became a whole lot easier, recognizing the eternal implications that are behind it. Have you entered into that work? Have you found yourself in a position to commit your life to serving? If not, if you have not found yourself in obedience to the gospel, if you've not submitted yourself to His plan and become His child and His servant, why not make that decision tonight? Friends, the harvest is great, but the workers are few, and we need you. We need you first and foremost to think about your soul. And we need you to recognize that in sin you're lost. But you don't want to be lost. And because you don't want to be lost, but you are, you need to get out of your sin. Why not do that tonight? If you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you'll repent of your sin and confess your faith and be immersed in water tonight, you can have your sins washed away, be added to the body, and become a servant of God entering the vineyard even tonight. Maybe you've done those things in the past, but since time, you haven't served like you should have. You haven't lived like you should have. And now in examining yourself, you know that. And you know that there are changes that you need to make. And you want to do that tonight. Why not come now and repent of those sins, confess them, pray to God for forgiveness. And our God promises you that He will forgive you, wipe the slate clean, give you the second opportunity that you need. Do you need that? Do you want it? To become a true fisher of men tonight and a servant of God, we want you to and we need you to. Why not do it even now while together we stand and sing?